Welcome to Declassified History, and before we begin, let me tell you something that will change everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War. At exactly 2:45 a.m. on January 31st, 1968, 19 Viet Cong sappers blew a hole through the wall of the most protected American fortress in Saigon, and what happened in the next 6 hours was so chaotic, so unexpected, and so deliberately misreported that even today, the full truth remains buried in classified files and the fading memories of the men who were there. But here's what will shock you most. The attack on the U.S. Embassy wasn't supposed to happen at all. It was a last-minute diversion, a throwaway mission that the Viet Cong leadership considered almost suicidal. Yet it became the single most iconic image of the entire Tet Offensive, broadcast into American living rooms and shattering the illusion that the United States was winning this war. But what you've never been told, what the cameras didn't show, what the official reports carefully omitted, is that the enemy commandos had actually been living in plain sight just 3 blocks from the embassy for over 2 weeks, renting rooms in a small mechanic's shop, drinking tea with locals, smiling at passing American patrols, waiting for the signal that would turn them into ghosts, storming the gates of American power. And even more disturbing is this. The attack almost failed before it began because one of the VC sappers got drunk the night before and had to be physically carried to the staging point, his commanders debating whether to shoot him or let him sleep it off, ultimately deciding that they needed every man because they knew this was a suicide mission. They knew none of them would likely see another sunrise, yet they went anyway. And here's where it gets truly strange. The American MPs guarding the embassy that night had actually reported suspicious activity around the compound for 3 consecutive nights prior to the attack. They had seen motorbikes circling the perimeter, men in civilian clothes taking photographs, vehicles parking in unusual locations. But each time they filed reports, each time they requested additional security, they were told they were being paranoid, that there was no credible threat, that the Tet holiday ceasefire was holding. And so, when the first explosion ripped through the night air at 2:47 a.m., when the embassy's 8-foot wall crumbled and armed men poured through the gap, the 2 MPs on duty, Specialist 4 Charles Daniel and Private First Class William Sebast, had exactly 4 seconds to react. And in those 4 seconds, in that fragment of time that seemed to stretch into eternity, Daniel managed to grab the radio and scream 3 words that would echo through history. "They're coming in," and then the firing started. And what you need to understand about those first moments is that the Viet Cong sappers weren't trying to occupy the embassy. They weren't trying to take hostages or steal documents. Their mission was pure symbolism, pure psychological warfare. Their orders were simple: breach the wall, enter the compound, kill Americans, and hold the position long enough for the world's cameras to arrive. Because they understood something that military strategists would debate for decades afterward. In modern warfare, the image is often more powerful than the objective, the perception more damaging than the reality, and they were right. Because even though the attack was ultimately repelled, even though all 19 attackers were killed, even though they never actually entered the embassy building itself, the photographs of dead American soldiers on the embassy lawn, the footage of Marines taking cover behind planters on American sovereign soil, the image of Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker being evacuated in his pajamas, these became the defining moments that turned American public opinion against the war. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. The CIA station chief in Saigon had actually received intelligence about a possible embassy attack 3 weeks before Tet. The information came from a VC defector who provided specific details about a multi-wave assault planned for the holiday period. But the intelligence was deemed low confidence because the source couldn't provide an exact date, couldn't name the specific unit assigned to the mission, and frankly, because the idea of attacking the embassy seemed so audacious, so tactically pointless, that senior officials dismissed it as disinformation. And this failure of imagination, this inability to think like an enemy who valued propaganda victories as much as military ones, cost American lives and changed the course of history. And if you think that's shocking, wait until you hear what happened inside the embassy compound during those 6 hours of fighting. Because the official story, the one you read in history books, tells you that military police and Marine Guards held the building until a relief force arrived at dawn. And while that's technically true, it leaves out the absolute chaos, the friendly fire incidents, the moment when an American helicopter gunship nearly fired rockets into the embassy itself because radio communications were so confused that pilots couldn't determine who controlled what positions. It leaves out the fact that the embassy's senior security officer was off compound when the attack began, at a party celebrating the Tet holiday, didn't return until after sunrise. It leaves out the bizarre detail that one of the slain VC sappers was found carrying a detailed floor plan of the embassy interior, accurate down to the location of individual offices, suggesting either a security breach or incredibly sophisticated reconnaissance. And most disturbingly, it leaves out what was found in the pockets and packs of the dead attackers. Photographs of their families, letters written to loved ones knowing they'd never be mailed, small amounts of money that would never be spent, and in one case, a diary whose final entry, written just hours before the attack, read, "We go tonight to make history, we die so Vietnam can live," and that's the part that should haunt us. That these weren't mindless fanatics or drugged-up terrorists. They were soldiers who made a calculated decision to trade their lives for a strategic objective. And it worked. It worked beyond their commanders' wildest expectations. Because while they died on that embassy lawn, while their bodies were photographed and their mission was technically a military failure, they won the larger battle. They proved that nowhere was safe, that American power was vulnerable, that this war was far from won. And the shockwaves from that realization would ultimately force a president from office and lead to American withdrawal. But here's the question nobody asks. Who were these 19 men? The American media called them suicide commandos and Viet Cong sappers, reducing them to faceless enemies. But North Vietnamese records, declassified decades later, reveal that they were members of the C-10 Sapper Battalion, elite troops who had trained for months specifically for urban warfare. Their leader was a 32-year-old former schoolteacher named Ut No, who had joined the resistance after his village was destroyed in a bombing raid. His second in command was a 19-year-old from the Mekong Delta, who had never traveled more than 50 miles from his birthplace, until he volunteered for this mission. And among them was a 45-year-old grandfather who was the oldest member of the team, who everyone assumed would be assigned to a support role, but who insisted on being in the first wave through the wall because, as he told his comrades, "I have already lived a full life. You have futures ahead of you." And when the wall exploded and bullets started flying, he was the third man through the gap. And he made it exactly 12 feet before an MP's bullet found him. But here's what's truly heartbreaking. His body wasn't identified and returned to his family until 1998. 30 years after the battle, when forensic teams finally matched remains to names. And his granddaughter, who was 3 years old when he died, was a 53-year-old grandmother herself when she finally learned where he was buried. And she said something in an interview that I can't stop thinking about. She said, "The Americans remember this as the day their embassy was attacked. We remember it as the day our fathers didn't come home." And that's the tragedy of war, isn't it? The same event, the same bullets, the same blood, remembered completely differently depending on which side you were born on. But the embassy attack, as dramatic and symbolically important as it was actually the smallest part of the Tet Offensive story. It was just the hook, the attention grabber, the image that made headlines, because while cameras focused on Saigon, while reporters narrated the embassy siege, while Americans watched in horror from their living rooms, something far more brutal, far more consequential, was beginning 400 miles to the north in an ancient city that most Americans had never heard of, a city called Hue. And what happened there over the next 28 days would make the embassy attack look like a minor skirmish, because at 3:40 a.m. on that same January morning, while embassy guards were still fighting in Saigon, 10,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops launched a coordinated assault on Hue from 4 different directions. And unlike the symbolic raid in Saigon, this wasn't a hit-and-run propaganda strike. This was a full-scale invasion designed to capture and hold the city, to establish it as the capital of a revolutionary government, to create facts on the ground that would force negotiations and demonstrate that the communists could take and control major urban centers. And initially, it worked. A turning point, not just strategically, but in how Americans understood the war, the extended television coverage, the images of Marines fighting street by street, the rising casualty counts, the destruction of a cultural treasure. All of this contradicted the official narrative of progress, of light at the end of the tunnel, of an enemy on the verge of defeat. And the Marines who fought there knew it, Sergeant Bob Tom said in an interview. We took Hue. We won the battle, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving, and when it was over and we saw what was left of the city, what we'd had to destroy to save it, I think a lot of us started questioning what we were really doing there. And that, quote, destroy it to save it, became one of the defining phrases of the Vietnam War. It captured the paradox, the futility, the tragic irony of the whole enterprise, and nowhere was that more apparent than in Hue. Because by the time the city was finally secured on March 2nd, after 28 days of fighting, after 142 American Marines killed and over 1,000 wounded, after perhaps 5,000 communist troops dead, after thousands of civilians killed or missing, after 70% of the city was damaged or destroyed, after the ancient beauty of Vietnam's cultural heart was reduced to rubble, the question everyone was asking was it worth it? And the answer depends on who you ask. American commanders called it a victory. They'd retaken the city, killed large numbers of enemy troops, demonstrated that the communists couldn't hold urban areas against determined counterattack. But the Viet Cong and NVA also claimed victory. They'd held a major city for a month. They'd inflicted heavy casualties on American forces. They'd proven their ability to launch coordinated large-scale operations. And most importantly, they'd achieved their strategic objective. They'd shocked the American public and changed the political calculus of the war. And the Vietnamese civilians caught in the middle, they didn't call it a victory at all. They called it a catastrophe, a nightmare. The time when war came to their streets and took their homes, their families, their history. And here's something most people don't know. The trauma of Hue didn't end when the fighting stopped. The city that emerged from the battle was fundamentally different from the city that existed before. Thousands of residents were homeless, families were torn apart, the dead were so numerous that mass burials were necessary, and the psychological scars lasted generations. But there's also this. In the years after the war, when Vietnam was unified under communist rule, Hue became a difficult memory for the government in Hanoi, because the battle revealed uncomfortable truths on both sides. The executions and mass graves contradicted the narrative of liberation, while the heroic last stand also contradicted the narrative of inevitable victory. So for years, Hue existed in a kind of historical limbo, not forgotten exactly, but not fully acknowledged, not examined with the honesty it deserved. And it's only recently, as Vietnam has opened up more, as veterans from both sides have begun sharing their stories, as historians have gained access to previously classified materials, that a more complete picture has emerged. And what that picture shows is complexity. It shows heroism and atrocity, strategy and chaos, victory and defeat, all mixed together in ways that defy simple categorization. And maybe that's the real lesson of Hue, maybe the real lesson of the entire Tet Offensive, that war is never the clean narrative we want it to be. It's messy and contradictory and morally ambiguous. And the people who fight wars, on all sides, are not characters in a story, but human beings making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. And when we reduce them to heroes or villains, winners or losers, we lose something essential. We lose the truth. And here at Declassified History, that's what we're after. Not the sanitized version, not the propaganda from either side, but the complicated, difficult, human truth of what actually happened, and the truth about Tet, about the embassy attack and the Battle of Hue, is that it was a military defeat for the communists, but a strategic victory. It was a tactical success for the Americans, but a political disaster. It was a moment when both sides suffered terribly, and both sides could claim vindication. And it ultimately led to American withdrawal, not because the United States couldn't win militarily, but because the American public decided the cost wasn't worth paying. And whether that was the right decision or not, whether the sacrifice of those Marines in Hue meant something or was wasted, is a question everyone has to answer for themselves. But what's not debatable, what should never be forgotten, is that these events happened. These people existed. These sacrifices were made. And they deserve to be remembered fully, honestly, with all the complexity and contradiction that entails, because the 19 Viet Cong sappers who died at the embassy, the Marines who fought through the streets of Hue, the Vietnamese civilians caught between armies not of their choosing, they were all real people, with families and dreams and futures that were cut short or forever altered by decisions made in distant capitals, by leaders who never had to face the consequences of their choices. And if we're going to learn anything from history, if studying the past is going to mean anything, we have to sit with that discomfort. We have to acknowledge that there are no clean answers, no simple lessons, just the accumulated weight of individual human experiences. And that's what we've tried to bring you today, the unknown facts about the embassy attack that show it was both less and more than it appeared. The rare footage from Hue that complicates our understanding of who was there and why, and the soldier stories that remind us these weren't pawns on a strategic map, but 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds who bled and died in the ruins of an ancient city. And if you've made it this far, if you've stayed with us through this entire journey, then you understand what declassified history is all about. We're not here to give you easy answers or confirm what you already believe. We're here to dig into the archives, to find the stories that don't make it into the textbooks, to complicate your understanding rather than simplify it. Because history isn't simple, war isn't simple, and the people who lived through these events deserve better than to be reduced to footnotes in someone else's narrative. So thank you for watching, thank you for engaging with this difficult material, and if you want more stories like this, more deep dives into the moments that changed history, the battles that shaped our world, the individual experiences that get lost in the grand sweep of events, then subscribe to Declassified History. Hit that notification bell, and join us next time as we continue uncovering the truth behind the headlines. Two small compounds, the MACV compound south of the Perfume River and the Imperial Palace, where a small group of ARVN troops held out. The enemy had raised their flag over the citadel. They'd set up command posts in government buildings. They'd begun going house to house with lists of names, lists of targets, lists of enemies of the people who needed to be re-educated or eliminated. And this is where the story gets dark, darker than most documentaries want to acknowledge. Because what happened in Hue during those first few days wasn't just military combat, it was systematic political violence. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians, government officials, teachers, doctors, merchants, Catholic priests, anyone associated with the Saigon government or the Americans were rounded up, and many were never seen again. Mass graves would be discovered in the months and years after Tet, bodies bound with wire, skulls showing execution wounds, and the numbers are still disputed. Some sources say 3,000 killed, others say 6,000. The truth probably lost forever in the chaos and competing propaganda. But what's undeniable is that something horrific happened. And it happened while the world's attention was elsewhere. And here's the part that's been buried, deliberately forgotten by both sides. There's Viet Cong footage of this, actual film shot by communist cameramen who accompanied the troops into Hue. And for decades, this footage was classified, locked away in archives in Hanoi, too politically sensitive to release because it showed things that contradicted the heroic narrative of liberation. It showed executions, it showed terror, it showed the dark side of revolutionary justice, but in 2008, a Vietnamese filmmaker named Nguyen Duc was granted limited access to these archives, and what he found was hours of raw footage, unedited, uncensored, showing the battle for Hue from the perspective of the soldiers who captured it. And while most of this footage remains classified, while the Vietnamese government still controls what can be shown, fragments have leaked out, snippets have appeared in obscure documentaries, and what they reveal is extraordinary. There's footage of VC troops moving through the early morning darkness, their faces young and nervous, some smiling at the camera, others looking terrified. There's footage of the first moments of the assault, tracers lighting up the pre-dawn sky, explosions blooming in the distance, commanders shouting orders, and then there's footage from inside the city after it was taken, and this is where it becomes surreal. Because you see communist soldiers wandering through the ancient streets of Hue like tourists, marveling at the imperial architecture many had only heard about in stories. You see them raising the flag, see them celebrating what they believed was a permanent victory, what they thought was the beginning of the end for the Saigon government. But you also see something else, something the cameramen weren't necessarily supposed to film but did anyway. You see civilians being rounded up. You see the fear in their eyes. You see people being marched away with hands bound. And while the footage cuts before showing what happened next, the implication is clear. And this creates a moral complexity that simple war narratives can't contain, because yes, these were soldiers fighting against what they perceived as foreign invasion and a puppet government. But they were also participants in atrocities, and both things can be true simultaneously. War doesn't allow for moral simplicity, no matter how much we might want it to. And the footage also shows something else, something that helps explain what came next. It shows VC soldiers fortifying positions, digging in, preparing for a counterattack they knew was coming, and you can see in their faces, in their body language, the gradual realization that this wasn't going to be the easy victory they'd been promised, that holding Hue was going to be much harder than taking it. And they were right, because by February 1st, American and South Vietnamese forces had begun the counteroffensive. And this is where we get to the stories, the individual experiences of the Marines who fought house to house, room to room, through the ancient streets of a city they've been ordered to recapture but not destroy, which is like asking someone to perform surgery with a sledgehammer, and the first Marines into Hue had no idea what they were getting into. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Cheatham, commander of 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, was told to enter the city and clear out a few pockets of resistance. Intelligence estimates suggested maybe a couple hundred enemy troops, light opposition, a day or two of fighting at most. So when his lead companies crossed the bridge into Hue and were immediately hit by a wall of fire from fortified positions, when Marines started dropping in the streets, when it became clear that the few pockets of resistance were actually thousands of entrenched enemy troops, the shock was total. Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, who had posthumously received the Medal of Honor for his actions in Hue, told his squad, "We're not in Kansas anymore," which would be funny if it wasn't so horrifically accurate, because these young Marines, most barely out of high school, trained for jungle warfare and rice paddy operations, suddenly found themselves in Stalingrad, in close-quarters urban combat that their training had barely prepared them for, and the rules of engagement made it even worse because Hue wasn't just any city. It was Vietnam's ancient imperial capital, a UNESCO cultural heritage site filled with temples, palaces, and irreplaceable historical architecture, So the Marines were told to minimize damage, to avoid artillery strikes, to limit air support, to essentially fight with one hand tied behind their backs. And this led to scenes that seem impossible in modern warfare. Marines storming NVA positions with M16s and grenades because they couldn't call in artillery, charging across open courtyards because there was no other way forward, fighting floor by floor through buildings that had stood for centuries and were now killing grounds. And the stories from these Marines are absolutely harrowing. Lance Corporal Scott Nelson described entering a house where his squad immediately came under fire from the second floor. They returned fire, threw grenades, and when they finally cleared the building, they found 3 dead NVA soldiers, 2 dead civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire, and a baby, somehow alive, crying in a back room, covered in dust and blood but miraculously uninjured. And Nelson said the hardest thing he ever did was leave that baby there because they couldn't take it with them. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, and he still wonders what happened to that child. Still sees that crying face in his dreams 50 years later, and that's just one story, one Marine, one house in a battle that lasted 28 days and involved hundreds of buildings, thousands of rooms, and there are so many more stories, like Corporal Steve Berntson, who described a fight for a 3-story building that took 11 hours. 11 hours for one building, room by room, grenade after grenade, until his hands were bleeding from throwing them, until he'd gone through 6 magazines and was down to his last rounds. And when they finally secured the building, when the shooting finally stopped, they found an NVA command post on the top floor with maps showing the entire communist battle plan, showing positions and units and objectives, intelligence that proved invaluable for the larger battle but felt meaningless in that moment because Berntson had just lost 2 friends taking those stairs, or the story of Lieutenant Ray Smith, whose platoon got pinned down in a courtyard by a heavy machine gun position they couldn't locate. They could hear it, could see the muzzle flash, but couldn't get an angle on it, and they were stuck there for 3 hours. 3 hours lying in the mud taking fire, unable to advance or retreat, until a Marine named Garcia, Smith doesn't remember his first name, just Garcia, stood up, exposed himself completely to draw fire, located the position in the split second before bullets found him, and screamed the location to his squad before he went down. And they took out the machine gun, but Garcia was dead. And Smith said, "He saved all our lives and I don't even know his first name. I've spent 50 years trying to find out, trying to contact his family, and I can't. It's like he was erased from the records, and that haunts him. The idea that someone can sacrifice everything and just disappear from history. And these stories multiply, each one a small tragedy within the larger tragedy. Like the squad that cleared a house only to have it retaken by NVA troops an hour later, forcing them to fight for the same ground twice. Or the Marine who spent 6 days thinking his best friend was dead, only to find him alive in a field hospital. Or the 19-year-old corpsman who ran into fire again and again to pull wounded Marines to safety, who used up all his medical supplies in the first week and started tearing up his own uniform to make bandages, who kept working even after taking shrapnel in his leg, and who finally collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, and woke up on a hospital ship, not remembering the previous 48 hours. And what makes all these stories even more powerful is that many of them were never officially recorded. They exist only in the memories of survivors, in interviews conducted decades later by historians and researchers, because the official after-action reports are dry, clinical. They talk about securing objectives and neutralizing enemy positions. They don't capture the terror, the confusion, the moral ambiguity of fighting in a